In the remote, mist-shrouded hills of northern Spain, long before the age of modern roads and railways, there existed a village unlike any other, a place where the normal rhythms of life were deeply entwined with something far stranger, almost unnerving in its singularity. Nestled between jagged mountain peaks and dense, shadowed forests, the village appeared from a distance like a cluster of stone and timber houses clinging stubbornly to the landscape, as if resisting the encroaching wild. The air was perpetually tinged with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, and in winter, a heavy fog often rolled through the narrow, uneven streets, muffling sound and lending an otherworldly quality to even the most mundane of daily activities. Travelers who chanced upon this place spoke later of an eerie stillness, a sense of time moving differently, and the subtle, unspoken feeling that the villagers were guarding secrets not meant for outsiders. Life within the village was rhythmically ordinary yet suffused with peculiar customs that set it apart from neighboring communities. Families tended small plots of land, raised goats and sheep, and gathered in the modest central square for festivals, religious observances, and market days. Children played along cobblestone lanes, weaving between houses whose walls were streaked with moss and smoke stains, their laughter echoing strangely against the high cliffs that hemmed the settlement in. But beneath this veneer of pastoral normality, there existed a singular social custom so extreme that it would baffle anyone who learned of it. The villagers would only marry one another. No outsiders were ever taken as spouses. No matter how distant or nearby the neighboring towns, no traveler, merchant, or wandering noble could find a place among them. Marriage was a closed system, a covenant bound not by law alone but by an almost obsessive adherence to tradition. This practice, at first glance, might seem quaint, perhaps even charming, a quaint story of loyalty and local pride. But as one delved deeper into the implications, a far more chilling picture emerged. Every generation, for decades, and possibly centuries, was drawn from the same pool of families, the same handful of surnames echoing through the birth and death records like a haunting refrain. To outsiders, this might appear merely eccentric, a relic of rural insularity. Yet, as historians and genealogists would later note, the consequences of such extreme endogamy were profound, both socially and biologically. There were whispers of children born with strange physical traits, of families plagued by recurring illness, of entire lineages that seemed locked in an inescapable cycle. The village's story, as it survives in fragmented parish records and travelers' diaries, reads almost like a cautionary tale, a dark experiment of human isolation that predates formal genetic understanding by centuries. To understand the full weight of this peculiar practice, one must first imagine the world in which it arose. Spain in the late 17th century was a tapestry of competing powers, deeply steeped in religious authority and social hierarchy. Rural villages were often governed more by local custom than by law, and the church's influence pervaded nearly every aspect of life, from birth to marriage to death. In this context, the villagers' insistence on marrying within their own community might have seemed, to them, a logical extension of social preservation. Property remained within families, alliances were strengthened, and the boundaries of the village were protected from external interference. Yet, there was a tension between the protective instincts of tradition and the creeping, often invisible consequences of isolation. The human body, after all, is not designed to withstand repeated cycles of close communions without paying a toll, and the social fabric itself can strain under the weight of secrecy and insularity. Eyewitness accounts from the era, though sparse and often tinged with moral judgment, paint a picture of villagers who were fiercely proud of their self-contained society. Outsiders describe a mixture of admiration and unease: admiration for the cohesion and resilience of the community, unease at the palpable sense of difference, the almost palpable otherness that hung over the settlement like morning fog. Stories circulated of weddings that were celebrated with great pomp yet strictly regulated by local elders, of households that meticulously recorded family connections to ensure compliance with centuries-old rules, of subtle forms of enforcement, both social and moral, that ensured no one broke the covenant of insularity. These accounts, filtered through centuries of retelling, hint at a delicate balance between loyalty, superstition, and control, a balance that, when tipped, could reveal the darker consequences of their choices. There is something inherently macabre in imagining a society in which marriage is not merely a personal or romantic choice, but a ritualized act bound by the strictures of lineage and geography. The villagers, whether consciously or unconsciously, were engaged in a centuries-long experiment, one in which the variables were family, heredity, and environment, and the results would be measured in the health and survival of each generation. Unlike the controlled settings of modern science, however, this experiment was lived, experienced, and suffered by real people. Children born with deformities, elders watching repeated patterns of illness, families forced to navigate love, loyalty, and desire within a constricting social framework. For historians peering back from the present day, the village represents a striking, almost allegorical study of isolation, how culture can dictate human behavior, how geography can shape society, and how tradition can straddle the line between protection and peril. And yet, there is a strange humanity in the villagers' choices. To outsiders, their customs may seem cold or unnatural, but within the context of their lives, the practice was a form of preservation, a way of maintaining identity and cohesion in a world that was often dangerous and unpredictable. It speaks to the lengths people will go to preserve community, lineage, and a sense of belonging, even when such preservation carries unintended consequences. There is an undeniable tension here, one that would grip any observer. The tension between the admirable and the horrifying, the familiar and the uncanny, the visible social bonds and the invisible costs they exacted over time. As the fog rolled over the mountains each morning, shrouding the village in a soft grey light, one could imagine the children playing unaware of the legacy they inherited. The elders, with faces weathered by wind and sun, would watch carefully, knowing that every union, every child, every life was a link in an unbroken chain. To live in this village was to be both nurtured and trapped, protected and constrained, loved and scrutinized. And to look back on it now, centuries later, is to confront a story that is at once fascinating and unsettling, a story of human resilience, of social obsession, and of the quiet, haunting consequences that arise when a community binds itself so tightly to its own rules that the outside world is effectively shut out. It is in this shadowed, isolated, and seemingly timeless space that the village existed, clinging stubbornly to its traditions, quietly resisting change, and producing a narrative that would long outlive it. The story of the village that married only itself is not just a historical curiosity. It is a lens through which we can examine the human impulse toward preservation, the complex interplay between culture and biology, and the eerie, often tragic outcomes that can emerge when isolation and tradition intersect. And so, the tale begins here, in the cold, misty hills of northern Spain, with a village whose lives, choices, and secrets would echo far beyond the stone walls and narrow streets, leaving a legacy that is as haunting as it is instructive. The village's isolation was no accident of history. It was written into the very landscape itself. Northern Spain, particularly the region in which this village lay, was a labyrinth of jagged peaks, deep valleys, and dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The mountains rose sharply from the earth, their craggy faces cloaked in mist for much of the year, and the valleys below were narrow and shadowed, their rivers cold, fast, and treacherous. Travel through such terrain was arduous at best, and during winter months, it was often impossible. Roads were little more than winding dirt paths, carved precariously into cliffsides, slick with mud and hidden beneath layers of fog. Bridges were few and unreliable, and even the hardiest mule or horse could falter on the uneven terrain. To reach this village from any significant city or even neighboring towns required days of travel along these challenging routes, a journey that few outsiders attempted lightly. This geographical seclusion shaped every aspect of life in the village. Supplies were limited, trade with the outside world infrequent, and news from the broader world slow to arrive. Cultural ideas, fashions, and even technological innovations filtered in only haltingly, if at all. The villagers developed customs and social norms suited to survival in such isolation, often reinforcing habits that would seem peculiar, or even alarming, to an outside observer. Within the natural barriers created by the mountains, rivers, and forests, the community became self-contained. They relied on one another for everything: food, labor, protection, and social structure. There was little need to look beyond the cliffs that encircled them, and over generations, this self-sufficiency hardened into an unspoken insistence on insularity. The forests surrounding the village were dense and ancient, a tangle of oak, beech, and pine, their roots entwined in the soil so tightly that even the smallest path seemed hidden from casual view. Wildlife was abundant. Wolves, boars, and foxes prowled the shadows, and in winter, the snow-draped landscape made travel both treacherous and slow. These forests were not merely obstacles. They were guardians of the village's secrecy. Outsiders who attempted to penetrate them found the terrain unforgiving, and many who tried simply turned back, unnerved by the thick undergrowth, the sudden drops into ravines, or the eerie stillness that pervaded the woods. Villagers, by contrast, knew every hollow, ridge, and hidden spring. They moved through the terrain as if it were an extension of their homes, a secret world that belonged entirely to them. This intimate knowledge of their environment reinforced a sense of possession, of territoriality, that translated into every other aspect of life, including whom one married and how families were formed. The climate, too, played a role in the village's insularity. Winters were long, cold, and harsh, often burying the mountains in deep snow for months at a time. Roads became impassable, rivers froze or swelled with ice-cold meltwater, and the villagers were forced to rely entirely on their stored food and local resources. Summers, though milder, brought relentless rain that could swell the rivers and turn paths into quagmires, again isolating the community. Such conditions made the idea of welcoming outsiders not just impractical but almost dangerous. Any visitor had to be prepared for hardship, for cold, for scarcity, and for the subtle suspicion of the villagers, who were accustomed to guarding themselves against both environmental and social threats. The isolation was a crucible, shaping a society that depended entirely on internal cohesion, where survival required cooperation and conformity. This combination of geography, forest, and climate also had a profound psychological effect on the villagers. To live in such a landscape was to exist in a world that was at once beautiful and perilous, one in which the natural world exerted constant pressure on human life. It was a place where one learned early that resources were finite, that danger could appear without warning, and that trust was earned slowly, often only within the narrow confines of family and immediate neighbors. The mountains and forests created not only physical barriers but mental ones, fostering a worldview in which the outside world was distant, abstract, and, in many ways, irrelevant. It was an environment that encouraged inward focus, a careful observation of social bonds, and an almost obsessive attention to lineage, inheritance, and loyalty. These factors would later help explain why the villagers adhered so strictly to marrying within their own community. It was not simply tradition, but a strategy born of centuries of navigating isolation and scarcity. Historical travelers and chroniclers who ventured into this region often commented on the disorienting quality of the terrain. One noted that the mountains seemed to close in like walls, hiding villagers from both sight and knowledge, while another described the valleys as shadowed corridors where the sun barely touched the earth, and where one's presence was always observed, though never truly understood. These descriptions hint at the way isolation was experienced, not merely in terms of distance but as a lived reality that shaped thought, culture, and social norms. The villagers' worldview, their moral codes, and even their rituals were all intimately connected to the land. They understood themselves as part of a small, protected ecosystem, where outside influence was not merely unwanted but potentially threatening. Over time, this extreme isolation produced social structures that were highly insular and self-reinforcing. Families intermarried across generations, not out of cruelty or ignorance, but out of a pragmatic understanding of survival and cohesion. Outsiders were treated with caution. Outsiders' customs, ideas, and genes were unknown quantities in a world already defined by risk and unpredictability. Within the village, elders meticulously maintained genealogies, not merely as historical record but as a means of regulating marriage and inheritance. To break with these customs was to threaten the delicate balance that had sustained the community through generations of hardship. In a place where a single harsh winter could devastate crops and livestock, social cohesion and predictability were as critical to survival as food or firewood. The natural barriers that so effectively isolated the village also preserved its mysteries. Outsiders could not easily observe the rituals, the daily routines, or the patterns of marriage and family life. Records were kept within the village, private and inaccessible, and the subtle enforcement of social norms ensured that even visitors who remained for days or weeks would witness only the carefully curated face of the community. This secrecy, born of both geography and custom, contributed to the later fascination with the village. Historians, geneticists, and storytellers alike would find in it a rare case study, a microcosm in which human behavior, biology, and culture intersected in ways seldom recorded elsewhere. In this remote and perilous landscape, the village existed as a world unto itself, a place where nature and human society intertwined so completely that each reinforced the other. The isolation dictated behavior, dictated marriage, dictated survival, and in so doing created a unique social experiment, one that would leave a legacy of intrigue, tragedy, and insight long after the mountains had reclaimed the old paths and the forests had swallowed the roads. It was a landscape that shaped human destiny, a geography so intimate and confining that it became inseparable from the story of the people who lived within it, and from the dark, fascinating tale of a community that chose, for reasons both practical and mysterious, to marry only itself. To truly understand the village's peculiar insistence on marrying only within itself, it is necessary to place it firmly within the historical and cultural context of 1694 Spain, a time and place governed by rigid social hierarchies, deep religious influence, and a pervasive concern with lineage and legacy. This was an era when Spain, still recovering from centuries of dynastic conflict, reconquest, and internal strife, was a patchwork of kingdoms, fiefdoms, and small autonomous regions, each with its own traditions, laws, and social expectations. Rural communities, in particular, were largely self-governing, bound together not by distant monarchs or bureaucrats, but by shared labor, shared risk, and shared moral codes that were enforced as much by custom as by law. In such a framework, the maintenance of property, social cohesion, and familial honor was paramount, and every aspect of village life, from the crops planted to the festivals celebrated, was influenced by these concerns. Religion played an outsized role in shaping daily life and social behavior. The Catholic Church had long been a central authority in Spain, exerting influence over marriage, birth, death, and moral conduct. Parish priests often acted not merely as spiritual guides, but as record keepers, administrators, and enforcers of social norms. Marriage was a sacrament, not just a personal choice, and alliances between families carried weight beyond the romantic or personal. They determined inheritance, social standing, and, in rural areas, the very survival of households. Within this context, the village's practice of marrying exclusively among its own residents can be seen as both a reflection of religious orthodoxy and a response to the practical pressures of living in isolation. It was a way to preserve what was familiar, maintain property within known hands, and ensure that the next generation was raised according to values and practices already understood and trusted. Political and economic pressures further reinforced the community's self-contained structure. Northern Spain in the late 17th century was not a densely connected region. It was characterized by scattered settlements, limited infrastructure, and local economies heavily dependent on agriculture, animal husbandry, and small-scale crafts. Travel was difficult, communication slow, and trade risky. In such circumstances, villages often relied on internal networks for both economic and social stability. The village's rules governing marriage, inheritance, and family alliances were, therefore, not simply arbitrary. They were pragmatic strategies aimed at safeguarding wealth, resources, and survival. Marrying an outsider carried the potential for discord, the introduction of unfamiliar customs, and a dilution of the carefully maintained social and economic order. To outsiders, the village's strict adherence to internal marriage might seem excessive, even cruel, but in the context of their environment and the historical period, it was a deeply rational choice, however extreme. Education, literacy, and access to broader knowledge were limited. Most villagers could read only basic texts, often religious in nature, and the written word, beyond parish records, rarely penetrated the remote valleys. Oral tradition held sway, passing knowledge, warnings, and customs from one generation to the next. In this way, superstition, local legends, and collective memory reinforced the insularity of the community. Stories about the dangers of outsiders, the sacredness of family ties, and the consequences of breaking social rules were embedded in everyday life, shared around hearth-fires, during communal meals, or in the quiet moments of tending livestock. Children grew up with an intuitive understanding that their world was bounded, both physically by the mountains and forests and morally by the invisible lines of tradition that dictated who they could marry, who they could trust, and how they were to live. Yet, even in such a controlled environment, human desire and curiosity were not so easily constrained. Historical records and anecdotal accounts suggest that, despite the strict rules, individuals sometimes experienced longing for the unknown, for connection beyond the village boundaries, or for companionship that could not be fully satisfied within the narrow pool of potential spouses. The elders, who maintained genealogical records and regulated marriage decisions, wielded a subtle but unyielding power. They understood that deviation from the established patterns could have profound consequences, not just for the individual, but for the entire community. As such, enforcement was often psychological and social rather than overtly violent. Ostracism, gossip, and subtle pressures ensured compliance. Over time, this created a culture in which internal marriage was not merely expected, but normalized, almost instinctively. Children were raised to see the world in terms of the village, its families, its customs, its rules. Outside the mountains, the wider world existed only as a vague abstraction. The cultural emphasis on lineage and honor cannot be overstated. Families in the village were tightly knit, with ties spanning generations. Surnames repeated across the community, and extended families lived in close proximity, sharing labor, meals, and mutual support. This intimacy created an environment in which every individual's actions reverberated through the social fabric. To marry outside the village was not merely a personal choice. It was a potential betrayal of lineage, property, and collective identity. Each union was scrutinized, not only for compatibility but for genealogical suitability, ensuring that familial connections and alliances were maintained with exacting precision. Over decades, this produced a web of interrelated families, a network so complex and tightly woven that the boundaries between kinship and community blurred almost entirely. Economic factors reinforced these social patterns. The village's remote location meant that resources, arable land, livestock, and artisanal goods, were limited and carefully allocated. Property typically passed along family lines, and marriages within the village ensured that wealth and assets remained under the control of known and trusted hands. Outsiders, lacking both familiarity and proven loyalty, represented a potential threat to this fragile balance. In a community where survival could hinge on shared labor, cooperative harvesting, and mutual aid during illness or misfortune, the stakes of social cohesion were high. Internal marriage was, therefore, both an economic strategy and a social imperative, a way of guaranteeing that resources and responsibilities remained predictable and manageable. The historical moment also coincided with a broader European context in which notions of heredity, health, and morality were beginning to emerge, though often in rudimentary or speculative forms. Villagers may not have understood genetics as we do today, but they observed patterns, families marked by recurring illness, physical traits, or behavioral tendencies, and sought to manage them through the limited knowledge available to them. The practice of marrying within the community could have been seen as a way of preserving desirable traits or ensuring continuity of identity. Conversely, there may also have been a degree of fatalism, a recognition that risk was inherent in life, and that strict social regulation was one of the few levers of control available to them in an otherwise unpredictable world. Viewed through the lens of 1694, the village's choices were a product of multiple overlapping pressures: geography, climate, economics, religion, social custom, and collective memory. Each factor reinforced the others, creating a society in which marriage within the community became not only expected but necessary for survival. It was a delicate balance between pragmatism and tradition, between loyalty and constraint, and between the mundane needs of daily life and the extraordinary consequences of isolation. By understanding this context, one can begin to see the village not merely as an oddity, but as a logical response to the harsh realities of its time, a society shaped by circumstance, yet capable of producing both remarkable cohesion and tragic outcomes. The stage was thus set for the unfolding story of a community whose choices, while rooted in practicality, would carry consequences far beyond what its residents could have imagined. Within the narrow valleys and hidden valleys of northern Spain, a village existed that would become a living laboratory of social, genetic, and cultural forces, all operating under the watchful eyes of mountains, priests, and family elders. And it is from this historical backdrop that the tale of the village that married only itself begins to unfold, revealing the complex interplay of human desire, environmental pressure, and the inexorable pull of tradition. Life within the village was, on the surface, deceptively ordinary. Stone houses with thick, weathered walls were clustered along narrow, winding streets, their wooden shutters often thrown open to allow the muted sunlight to filter in during the brief summer months. Smoke from hearth fires curled into the air, carrying the scent of baking bread, roasting meat, and the ever-present tang of burning wood. Children ran barefoot across cobblestones, their laughter echoing off the mossy walls, while women tended gardens, milked goats, and prepared food for large, extended families. Men labored in fields, tended livestock, or carved wood and stone for trade with nearby settlements. On any given day, a visitor might see the familiar rhythms of a rural village, people greeting one another, market stalls displaying produce, livestock being led to pasture, and the sounds of communal work. Yet beneath this tranquil facade, there existed a subtle, almost imperceptible current of difference that separated this village from all others. It was not just the isolation imposed by geography, but a deliberate, cultural choice that defined every relationship, every household, and every social interaction. Families were tightly knit, often spanning multiple generations under a single roof or in adjacent homes. These extended households were both practical and social. They allowed labor to be shared efficiently, ensured that children were cared for, and created a constant reinforcement of familial bonds. But in this village, these bonds extended beyond mere utility. They were the foundation of a social experiment, maintained through meticulous records and oral histories. Every family had a place within the intricate network of intermarriages that defined the community. Names repeated across generations, creating a web of kinship that was at once comforting and, in retrospect, unnerving. Elders, with weathered hands and keen memories, acted as guardians of these connections, ensuring that no one strayed from the carefully constructed genealogical map. Weddings were not simply personal milestones, they were calculated moves in a centuries-long strategy of social preservation, binding families together, preserving wealth, and maintaining the village's insular identity. Daily life was suffused with ritual and routine, much of it shaped by necessity and the rhythm of the seasons. The long winters demanded preparation. Fires had to be maintained, crops stored, and livestock sheltered against the bitter cold. In summer, communal labor dominated the day, from tending fields to repairing roofs and fences. Festivals and religious observances punctuated these routines, providing both spiritual sustenance and social cohesion. Every feast, every holiday, every communal gathering was an opportunity to reinforce the invisible rules that governed the village. Through these gatherings, children learned their place in the social hierarchy, the obligations of family loyalty, and the expectations surrounding marriage and inheritance. There was a sense that the village itself was a living organism, each household a vital organ, each individual a cell, and that the health of the community depended upon strict adherence to the patterns set down by generations before. Despite the apparent harmony, the village's social structure was delicate, and tensions simmered beneath the surface. Marriage, while celebrated with music, feasts, and ritual, was also a source of anxiety and pressure. Elders scrutinized every potential union for genealogical compatibility, moral character, and economic suitability. Young adults, aware of their limited options, often felt both the weight of expectation and the constraints of choice. Love and personal desire were secondary to survival and propriety. Families monitored one another closely. Gossip served as both entertainment and social enforcement, a subtle means of regulating behavior and ensuring that no one violated the unspoken covenant of internal marriage. This ever-present scrutiny created a community where conformity was rewarded, deviation punished, and individuality was both nurtured and constrained within the boundaries of collective identity. Children grew up acutely aware of these rules, internalizing them as part of their understanding of the world. Play, education, and social interaction all reinforced the hierarchy and expectations of the village. Boys were trained in trades and labor appropriate to their family's position, girls in domestic skills, but both were taught the importance of lineage and the boundaries of acceptable relationships. Tales of past transgressions and their consequences were told around the hearth, often in hushed tones, creating a psychological reinforcement of social norms. Superstition mingled with history. Stories of ill-fated unions with outsiders, sudden illnesses, and mysterious misfortunes lent a sense of moral gravity to the village's choices. The young learned that marriage was not merely a personal matter, but a sacred duty, a link in an unbroken chain that connected generations past, present, and future. Occupations and roles within the village were highly structured, yet flexible enough to accommodate the practical realities of life in isolation. Men worked as farmers, herders, and craftsmen, producing tools, clothing, and goods necessary for survival. Women managed households, raised children, and participated in the production of food and textiles. Elderly villagers acted as advisors, storytellers, and keepers of tradition. Even leisure was organized around community life. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and collective workdays provided opportunities to reinforce alliances and observe the subtle hierarchy of status and favor within families. Music, dance, and local rituals were imbued with symbolism, often referencing ancestry, land, and divine favor, subtly reinforcing the importance of marrying within the community and maintaining the purity of its lines. Religion was deeply interwoven with everyday life. The village church, often modest in structure but central in importance, was not only a spiritual center but also a social hub, a place where families gathered, news was exchanged, and moral authority was observed. Priests and clergy played a subtle but pivotal role, offering guidance while also acting as arbiters of social conformity. Sacraments such as marriage, baptism, and confirmation were meticulously recorded, ensuring that each individual's life was documented and, by extension, that the integrity of family lines could be monitored. Religious observance reinforced the moral and social codes that underpinned the village's unique marital practices, providing a sacred sanction to what might otherwise appear as arbitrary social isolation. Despite the strict social rules, the villagers were not without warmth, affection, or complexity. Love, loyalty, and compassion existed alongside obligation and regulation. Parents were devoted to their children, siblings protected one another, and neighbors cooperated to ensure collective survival. The sense of belonging was profound, and for many, the village represented both home and identity, a place of safety amidst a harsh and unpredictable world. Yet the very structures that created cohesion also imposed limitations, shaping behavior, constraining desire, and subtly directing the course of individual lives for the sake of the community. It is within this tightly woven tapestry of daily life, familial obligation, and social expectation that the full impact of the village's insularity becomes apparent. Marriage was not merely a union between two individuals. It was an act of preservation, a deliberate reinforcement of identity, property, and tradition. Each family, each household, each individual contributed to a network that was as social as it was biological. To exist within the village was to participate in a living system, where every action, every choice, and every union was inextricably linked to the fate of the community. The villagers had created a world in which order, loyalty, and continuity were paramount, and in doing so, they set the stage for a story that would reveal both the extraordinary resilience and the hidden costs of life in isolation. In this context, the village becomes not merely a place, but a lens through which to examine human behavior, tradition, and the interplay between environment and society. Every path, every hearth, every field is imbued with meaning, shaped by centuries of isolation, necessity, and cultural insistence. And as one begins to trace the patterns of life, marriage, and kinship within the village, it becomes clear that the story of its people is as complex and compelling as the landscape itself, a narrative where the ordinary and the macabre coexist, and where the consequences of insularity reach far beyond the misty streets and stone walls of a single, secluded community. The origins of the village's practice of marrying exclusively within itself are as shrouded in mystery as the fog that perpetually clung to its surrounding mountains. To outsiders, it might seem an arbitrary or eccentric choice, yet closer examination reveals a complex interplay of historical circumstance, practical necessity, cultural tradition, and perhaps even superstition. The village did not exist in a vacuum, nor did its customs arise overnight. They were the product of generations of adaptation, survival, and deeply ingrained social logic. Over time, the repeated reinforcement of these practices created a culture in which internal marriage was not only expected but seen as essential to the village's continued existence, identity, and survival. One of the most compelling explanations lies in the economic and logistical realities of life in such isolation. In a community hemmed in by mountains and dense forests, travel was arduous and dangerous. Venturing beyond the village meant navigating treacherous paths, crossing rivers swollen by winter runoff, and confronting unfamiliar terrain and unknown people. Trade existed but was limited, and alliances with neighboring villages were rare and often fraught with tension. Within this context, marriage to an outsider represented a tangible risk. Newcomers might bring unfamiliar customs, differing expectations, or conflicts over property and inheritance. By restricting marriage to within the village, families ensured that wealth, land, and resources remained under the control of trusted hands, minimizing the risk of social disruption. In a world where survival often depended on cooperative labor, the predictability of familiar kin was a strategic advantage, not merely a matter of tradition. Religious and moral considerations also played a significant role. The Catholic Church, deeply embedded in every aspect of Spanish rural life, emphasized the sanctity of marriage, lineage, and moral conduct. Parish records, meticulously kept by the village clergy, documented births, deaths, and unions, creating an internal system of oversight that reinforced existing social norms. While the church itself did not dictate that villagers must marry only among themselves, the intertwining of religious observance with social enforcement lent a sacred authority to the practice. Marriages were not merely contractual or economic arrangements. They were considered divine covenants, linking family, faith, and the broader moral order. Within this framework, adherence to internal marriage could be interpreted as an act of piety, a way to preserve the community in accordance with what was perceived as divine will. Cultural and social pressures further cemented the practice. The village operated as an interdependent system, where every household relied on others for labor, protection, and social cohesion. Families had lived side by side for generations, developing intricate networks of mutual support, obligations, and alliances. These bonds created both trust and constraint, trust in the reliability of neighbors, but constraint in the form of rigid expectations about loyalty, behavior, and marital choice. Outsiders, no matter how well-intentioned, represented uncertainty. Their arrival could upset the balance of local labor, introduce untested behaviors, and threaten established hierarchies. By limiting marriage to the internal population, the village maintained both social stability and predictability, reinforcing norms that had proven successful over decades or even centuries of survival under challenging conditions. Superstition and local belief may also have played a subtler, psychological role. Villagers observed patterns, infant mortality, recurring illness, even strange accidents, and sought explanations rooted in morality, divine will, or ancestral guidance. Stories circulated of outsiders whose unions had led to misfortune, of families cursed by past missteps, and of spirits that punished those who broke communal rules. Such narratives, whether based in truth or legend, reinforced the moral and social authority of the elders who regulated marriage. Over generations, these beliefs became internalized. Children were raised with the implicit understanding that marrying beyond the village could invite both social and supernatural consequences. The line between practical caution and mystical warning blurred, creating a cultural framework in which internal marriage was perceived as both safe and sacred. Historical records hint at additional layers of influence. Early genealogical logs, preserved by the parish priests, show repeated patterns of intermarriage, often between distant cousins or extended family branches. Some scholars speculate that the village elders actively encouraged this practice, recognizing that it would concentrate wealth, maintain social cohesion, and prevent the dispersion of property and influence to outsiders. Others argue that it may have begun as a defensive strategy, a response to historical conflicts, raids, or encroachment by neighboring communities. In such a context, marrying internally would have served as both a protective measure and a means of reinforcing a shared identity, ensuring that the village remained self-sufficient and resilient in the face of external pressures. At the heart of the practice was a paradox. The very isolation that necessitated strict internal marriage also created the conditions for its consequences. Over time, repeated unions within a limited gene pool increased the likelihood of hereditary illness, unusual physical traits, and vulnerabilities that might not have manifested in a more genetically diverse population. Yet the villagers, guided by tradition, observation, and superstition, saw continuity and cohesion as more immediate concerns than abstract genetic risk. In their worldview, loyalty, identity, and survival were paramount, and the moral and social framework that had evolved over generations took precedence over outcomes that were often invisible until they became impossible to ignore. Social cohesion was reinforced through ritual and observation. Weddings, while communal celebrations, were also highly regulated events. Elders and priests would observe proposed unions, ensuring compatibility within the genealogical framework and confirming that the marriage would reinforce, rather than disrupt, the village's intricate network of relationships. Feasts, religious ceremonies, and communal gatherings served not only to celebrate but also to reaffirm these social bonds. Through repeated reinforcement, the norms of internal marriage became ingrained in the consciousness of every villager. To break them was to risk not only social censure but the destabilization of the very community that provided sustenance, security, and identity. The psychological impact of these customs on the villagers themselves cannot be overstated. For children growing up in the village, the boundaries of acceptable behavior, desire, and choice were learned early and internalized deeply. They were taught to value family loyalty, to respect ancestral decisions, and to see the broader implications of their marriages beyond personal inclination. Love and attraction were secondary to duty, yet they existed within the constraints of a system that carefully managed their expression. Over generations, this created a culture of discipline, obedience, and subtle social surveillance, where each individual understood the stakes of their choices and the consequences of deviation. The origins of the village's self-contained marital practices, therefore, were not the result of a single cause but a confluence of many. The unforgiving terrain, the necessity of survival, religious authority, social cohesion, superstition, and historical precedent. Each factor reinforced the others, creating a cultural ecosystem in which internal marriage was both logical and inevitable. It was a practice born of circumstance and sustained by centuries of reinforcement, one that balanced pragmatism with moral and cultural imperatives, producing a society that was cohesive, resilient, and yet, inevitably, vulnerable in ways that would become painfully apparent over time. In the fog-laden valleys and shadowed streets of the village, these forces played out in the lives of every family, every couple, and every child. The practice of marrying only within the village was no mere custom. It was a survival strategy, a moral code, and a cultural identity, wrapped together in a tightly bound system that shaped generations. It was a tradition that carried both strength and peril, a reflection of the extraordinary lengths to which humans will go to preserve their world, and a prelude to the dark, often tragic consequences that would emerge from centuries of self-imposed isolation. The meticulous records of marriage, birth, and death maintained within the village offer one of the clearest windows into its unusual social fabric, revealing patterns that would have seemed astonishing, if not alarming, to an outsider. Parish registries, painstakingly kept by the local clergy, chronicled generations of families, their unions, and their offspring. At first glance, these records appeared typical of any small rural community: names, dates, and familial relationships neatly listed. Yet as one examined them over decades, the patterns began to emerge: names repeated across centuries, couples bound together by layers of kinship, and family trees that were so tightly interwoven they resembled intricate lacework rather than separate lines of descent. The village, in effect, had created a closed genealogical system, one that mapped the interconnections of every individual and ensured that marriage remained an internal affair. The repetition of surnames and the recurrence of familial pairings over generations suggests a deliberate and consistent effort to maintain internal cohesion. Families that might have otherwise branched outward through marriage remained closely aligned, reinforcing alliances, property consolidation, and social hierarchy. Children grew up surrounded by extended kin, observing the same names, faces, and rituals repeated from generation to generation. The records reveal not just isolated instances of cousin marriages, but a systematic pattern of unions among second, third, and even more distant cousins, repeated across multiple branches of the community. In modern genetic terms, this level of intrarelatedness carries consequences, but at the time, the villagers would have interpreted it through a lens of social obligation, duty, and moral continuity. These genealogical constraints were enforced not only by cultural expectation but also by the vigilance of village elders and clergy. Each proposed union was examined against existing family trees to ensure compatibility, both in terms of lineage and social standing. The elders maintained detailed notes, often highlighting potential concerns regarding previous familial conflicts, property claims, or perceived moral character. In a sense, they acted as both social regulators and quasi-genetic advisors, though their understanding of heredity was necessarily observational rather than scientific. They could not measure genes or anticipate the full biological consequences of repeated close-kin unions, but they had developed a sophisticated, empirically based sense of the patterns that emerged over generations, guided by careful record-keeping and long experience. Historical notes suggest that some families became particularly prominent within the village, their members repeatedly intermarrying to concentrate wealth, influence, and status. These dominant lineages functioned as anchors, ensuring the persistence of social order and maintaining the continuity of traditions. At the same time, such concentration of familial ties inevitably intensified the risks associated with limited genetic diversity. Parish records reveal higher rates of infant mortality in certain lineages, recurring congenital abnormalities, and reports of children described as weak or delicate. While these notations were often couched in moral or spiritual language, they hint at a biological reality. Repeated internal marriages increase the likelihood of inherited traits and vulnerabilities manifesting across generations. Yet the villagers continued these practices, in large part because the benefits of cohesion and predictability outweighed the perceived risks. Marriage was as much a tool of social management as it was a personal union. Families bound together internally ensured that labor, property, and loyalty remained concentrated within the village, reducing external interference and maintaining a stable, functioning community. The internal marriage system also reinforced cultural memory. Traditions, religious observances, and oral histories could be transmitted seamlessly across generations without disruption from outsiders who might introduce new customs or challenge existing hierarchies. In this way, the village created not only a biological but also a cultural ecosystem that was remarkably resilient, even if it came at a hidden cost. The structure of these internal marriages also fostered complex and often fragile social dynamics. Because most individuals were related in some degree to nearly everyone else, relationships were layered with multiple connections. Siblings of one branch might be cousins of another, and a single marriage could simultaneously unite several family lines. These connections created strong bonds of loyalty, but they could also lead to tension, rivalry, and subtle forms of competition. Disputes over inheritance, status, or perceived slights were magnified in such a tightly interwoven network, and the social rules surrounding marriage functioned as a critical mechanism for mitigating conflict. Elders, by enforcing genealogical compatibility, sought to prevent these tensions from escalating, maintaining order and cohesion in a society where a single misstep could ripple across multiple families. Analysis of the records also reveals an extraordinary attention to detail. Clergy often noted not only names and dates but also qualities of character, health, and lineage that might affect the suitability of a match. They documented prior unions, the fertility of potential spouses, and sometimes even subtle social alliances that extended across multiple families. These annotations suggest a level of oversight that goes beyond mere record-keeping, hinting at a conscious effort to manage the village's internal population and maintain stability. Each marriage was an event of consequence, a carefully considered act that carried implications for both the immediate families and the community at large. There were also remarkable patterns of age and timing. Marriages tended to occur within narrow windows, often determined by agricultural cycles, seasonal festivals, or social rituals. Young adults were expected to marry when their labor could most benefit their household and the village economy, and delays or deviations were viewed with concern. Matchmaking, both formal and informal, played a central role, guided by elders who sought to balance familial obligations, genealogical alignment, and the practical realities of rural life. Even personal preference was subordinate to this system. Individuals understood that their choices were embedded within a larger framework designed to ensure the village's continued survival and cohesion. Despite the careful management of internal marriages, the genealogical web became increasingly intricate and, over time, precarious. The records indicate instances of repeated patterns of illness, physical anomalies, and psychological strain that would later be recognized as consequences of limited genetic diversity. Some families experienced clusters of conditions that appeared to recur across generations, while others were noted for exceptional health or resilience, suggesting that chance and circumstance played roles alongside cultural enforcement. Yet, these outcomes did not deter the continuation of internal marriage practices. In the village's worldview, social stability and loyalty remained paramount, and the mechanisms for survival, both practical and cultural, outweighed the abstract risks that would only become fully understood centuries later. In essence, the marriage records of the village tell a story of deliberate, long-term social engineering. They reveal a community deeply aware of its own structure, committed to preserving identity and continuity, and willing to impose constraints on personal choice for the sake of collective stability. They also hint at the subtle tension between resilience and vulnerability, showing how the very practices that ensured survival in a harsh, isolated environment also planted the seeds for biological and social consequences that could not be entirely controlled. Through these meticulous documents, the village emerges not just as a historical curiosity, but as a complex system in which every marriage, every birth, and every death was both a personal event and a chapter in a larger, ongoing narrative of human adaptation, cohesion, and consequence. As the generations passed, the consequences of the village's insularity began to reveal themselves in ways that were subtle at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. At the heart of the issue was biology. Repeated marriages within a tightly knit pool of families, often between distant cousins, had unintended effects on the health and vitality of successive generations. Children were born with unusual physical traits, some minor and barely noticeable, others more severe, drawing the attention of both villagers and visiting chroniclers alike. While the villagers lacked formal scientific knowledge, they observed patterns over decades, recording in parish registers when infants failed to survive, when illness struck repeatedly in certain families, or when unusual deformities appeared. To them, these patterns were at once a source of anxiety, a moral caution, and a deeply human concern for the continuity of life within the community. Infant mortality was one of the earliest and most visible consequences. In certain families, the death of newborns became alarmingly frequent, a pattern that appeared repeatedly over the course of decades. Elders noted these occurrences with a mix of resignation and ritualistic concern, often attributing the tragedies to divine will, ancestral disfavor, or improper adherence to social norms. While modern genetics can explain many of these outcomes as the result of accumulated recessive traits within a limited gene pool, to the villagers, the cause was often perceived through the lenses available to them: morality, superstition, and the intricate web of family obligations. Each death was mourned, but it also reinforced the sense that the community's survival was tied to the careful regulation of marriage and kinship. Beyond mortality, there were more visible physical manifestations. Parish records and chroniclers' notes describe children and young adults exhibiting traits that appeared unusual even to observers accustomed to rural hardships. Facial features, skeletal structures, and other physical characteristics sometimes clustered within certain lineages, producing a subtle but persistent pattern that could not be ignored. Some individuals were described as particularly delicate, weak, or prone to illness, while others displayed anomalies that may have been the result of repeated close-kin marriages. These traits, while often glossed over in everyday interactions, were recognized by the elders and clergy as indicators of the hidden costs of internal marriage. Yet despite these warnings, the practice persisted, reinforced by centuries of custom, expectation, and the practical imperatives of life in isolation. The consequences were not solely physical. They extended into mental and behavioral domains as well. Observers noted that certain families seemed prone to particular temperaments, from heightened anxiety and nervousness to episodes of unpredictable behavior. Whether these patterns were directly linked to genetic factors or arose from the pressures of living in a tightly controlled, socially constrained environment, they were documented with care. Children were raised under strict expectations, social roles were rigidly defined, and every deviation could attract scrutiny or censure. Over time, the combination of biological predisposition and social environment created a population that was remarkably cohesive, but also vulnerable, susceptible to both inherited frailty and the psychological stresses of an insular, tightly regulated community. Illness was a recurring specter. Families often suffered from conditions that appeared to pass from one generation to the next: diseases of the lungs, digestive complaints, and other chronic ailments that disproportionately affected the village population. While medical understanding in the 17th century was rudimentary, the villagers recognized patterns, observing that certain households were repeatedly afflicted while others seemed more resilient. Remedies were a mixture of herbal knowledge, folk practice, and religious application, applied with diligence but limited efficacy. The repeated occurrence of these maladies reinforced the elders' emphasis on careful marital planning, as they sought to balance the health of the community with the imperative of maintaining internal cohesion. Socially, the consequences of inbreeding were subtle but profound. Alliances and relationships were highly interdependent, and the cumulative effects of recurring illness or developmental anomalies could strain households, disrupt labor patterns, and create tension within the tightly knit community. Families that were disproportionately affected by sickness or weakness often relied on neighbors for support, reinforcing the interconnectedness of the village but also highlighting the fragile balance that sustained it. Every household, every marriage, and every child carried implications for the broader network of relationships, making social management a constant, delicate task for elders and clergy alike. Despite the challenges, the villagers exhibited remarkable resilience. They adapted their labor practices, shifted responsibilities within families, and developed cultural strategies to mitigate the effects of frailty and illness. Children were educated to take on roles early, households shared labor and resources, and communal gatherings provided both support and reinforcement of social cohesion. These strategies allowed the village to survive, even as it became increasingly clear that the population was biologically constrained. The combination of social ingenuity and cultural reinforcement helped maintain stability, but it could not eliminate the underlying vulnerabilities that had accumulated over generations. Perhaps the most haunting consequences were those that were less visible and more psychological. Living in such an insular society created a sense of inevitability, a pervasive awareness that life and opportunity were circumscribed by tradition, geography, and family ties. Individuals internalized the rules of the community from a young age, understanding that marriage was a duty rather than a personal choice, that deviation from the norms could bring shame, and that the well-being of the village depended upon compliance. These psychological pressures, combined with the observable biological consequences of internal marriage, created an environment in which both opportunity and freedom were constrained, shaping personality, ambition, and the rhythms of daily life in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to overlook. Chroniclers and visiting observers from outside the region often remarked on the eerie uniformity of appearance and temperament within the village. They noted patterns of familial resemblance, recurring behaviors, and a collective sense of cautious conformity. Outsiders were fascinated, sometimes horrified, and occasionally sympathetic, recognizing that the village's choices were as much a response to environmental and social pressures as they were a product of tradition or superstition. These reports, combined with the parish records, provide a rare glimpse into a population that was simultaneously resilient, adaptive, and vulnerable, shaped by centuries of isolation and the deliberate practice of marrying only within its own community. The village, in this sense, becomes a case study in the interplay between human culture, environment, and biology. Its story illustrates both the ingenuity and the unintended consequences of tightly controlled social systems. The very practices that ensured survival, cohesion, and identity also introduced vulnerabilities that would manifest in physical, psychological, and social ways. It is a testament to the human capacity for adaptation that the community persisted for generations despite these challenges, yet it is also a cautionary tale, a reminder of the costs of isolation and the delicate balance between tradition, necessity, and the unseen forces of inheritance. Through the lens of history, we see that the consequences of the village's internal marriages were neither uniform nor predictable, but they were inevitable. Patterns of mortality, illness, physical and behavioral traits, and social strain all intertwined to create a community that was tightly knit yet biologically constrained, culturally cohesive yet psychologically pressured, resilient yet vulnerable. These consequences would reverberate through the centuries, shaping the lives of countless individuals and leaving a haunting legacy that continues to fascinate historians, geneticists, and storytellers alike. The village's story is a powerful illustration of how the choices of a community, guided by environment, tradition, and necessity, can echo far beyond their immediate circumstances, producing outcomes both extraordinary and tragic. Life in the village, though regulated and orderly on the surface, was not without its share of tragedy, scandal, and whispered tales that seemed almost supernatural to outsiders. The insularity that preserved the community also amplified the consequences of human frailty, ambition, and misfortune, creating stories that would be recounted for generations. Among the villagers, misfortune was often interpreted as a combination of divine judgment, ancestral displeasure, and the inevitable effects of living in such a closed society. Every illness, accident, or untimely death carried an added weight, serving as a reminder that deviation from communal norms, or even mere carelessness, could ripple outward, affecting not just the immediate family but the delicate web of relationships that held the village together. One of the most persistent stories revolved around families that seemed cursed, their lineages plagued by repeated tragedies. Children born with physical deformities, sudden infant deaths, and chronic illness were seen not merely as biological misfortune but as signs that the family had somehow faltered in their adherence to tradition. These events were catalogued in parish registers, often with notes that framed them in moral or spiritual terms, suggesting divine displeasure or the repercussions of unwise marital choices. Villagers told these stories to one another, around hearths and during communal gatherings, reinforcing a culture of caution, obedience, and respect for the elders who managed these interwoven family networks. For outsiders, these tales could seem darkly exaggerated, but for those living within the village, they were a reality that shaped every decision. Rumors of scandal also circulated, often growing in the telling. Young adults who showed preference for a partner outside the village were quickly identified and subtly, but firmly, discouraged. Some stories describe whispered threats, social ostracism, and public shaming, designed to bring individuals back into line with communal expectations. One particularly haunting account describes a young woman who fell in love with a man from a neighboring town. Their secret correspondence was discovered, and although no physical punishment was recorded, the elders forced her into a marriage within the village. Soon after, several of her children were born with severe health issues, which villagers interpreted as confirmation of the dangers of breaking tradition. Whether coincidence or consequence, the story became a cautionary tale, repeated over generations to instill both fear and obedience in the young. Accidents and sudden deaths also took on an almost legendary status. Villagers frequently attributed unexpected misfortune to supernatural causes, curses from ancestors, wrathful spirits, or divine retribution. Chroniclers who visited the village noted accounts of people dying in unusual circumstances, illnesses striking entire households, and livestock vanishing under mysterious conditions. While many of these events can likely be explained through environmental hazards, disease, or coincidence, the interpretive lens of the village imbued them with a sense of moral significance. Each tragedy reinforced the community's sense of itself as both protected and constrained, governed by a web of rules that extended far beyond human logic. Local folklore flourished in the shadow of these real-life events, blending fact and fiction into stories that were passed down orally. Tales of forbidden love, ancestral curses, and mysterious disappearances became integral to the collective consciousness. These narratives served multiple purposes. They entertained, instructed, and reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior. For the young, listening to these stories was both thrilling and instructive, a means of understanding the consequences of breaking rules or venturing beyond the known world. The elders, meanwhile, used these tales to maintain authority and social cohesion, ensuring that each generation internalized the lessons of the past while participating in the intricate network of relationships that defined village life. Some of the more haunting stories involved the mysterious deaths of children and young adults, often coinciding with marriages that challenged social expectations. Chroniclers noted that these deaths were sometimes framed as punishment for disobedience or misaligned unions. Parish records occasionally reference sudden maladies or mysterious infirmities, leaving modern readers to speculate on whether these were instances of genetic disorders, environmental factors, or the natural hazards of 17th century life. Within the village, however, the moral and social implications were paramount. Every untimely death was interpreted within the context of the village's strict rules, reinforcing the belief that internal marriage was not merely tradition but a safeguard against misfortune. The psychological toll of these tragedies and rumors was profound. Children grew up in an environment where danger, illness, and moral consequence were closely linked in their minds. The boundaries of acceptable behavior were not abstract. They were reinforced daily by observation, gossip, and repeated cautionary tales. Adolescents learned quickly that transgression could have far-reaching consequences, and adults bore the weight of responsibility for both their own conduct and the well-being of their extended families. This constant vigilance created a community that was highly disciplined, deeply cohesive, and profoundly aware of the fragility of life. At the same time, it cultivated a sense of dread, a pervasive tension that underlay even the most mundane interactions. Scandal extended beyond the human realm as well. Livestock losses, crop failures, and unexplained fires were often interpreted as signs of imbalance within the village or as punishment for perceived moral failings. These events, while perhaps explainable by weather, disease, or accident, were woven into the larger narrative of communal vigilance and moral consequence. The village's worldview did not separate the human, natural, and spiritual realms. Each was intertwined, and each served as a mechanism for reinforcing social norms. Misfortune became a form of storytelling, a living moral framework that shaped both behavior and interpretation. Despite the darkness of these stories, there was also resilience and communal support. Families banded together during periods of illness or tragedy, providing food, labor, and care for those in need. Communal rituals, whether religious or cultural, reinforced a sense of belonging and offered mechanisms for processing grief and misfortune. The village's tight social networks ensured that tragedies, while individually devastating, rarely led to complete social collapse. Instead, they became part of the collective memory, woven into the narrative of survival and identity that defined the community. What emerges from these tales is a village that is at once real and legendary, human and mythic. The tragedies, scandals, and whispered legends reflect the consequences of extreme isolation, both socially and genetically, but they also illuminate the intricate mechanisms by which a community maintained cohesion, transmitted knowledge, and reinforced norms. The village's lives were structured around both visible and invisible rules, their behaviors shaped by the interplay of survival, tradition, and moral expectation. Every accident, illness, and death carried weight, serving as both warning and lesson, while every festival, wedding, and communal gathering reinforced the bonds that held the village together. In this way, the village's history is inseparable from its stories. The tragedies and scandals, real or perceived, are part of the village's DNA, shaping its culture, influencing decisions, and teaching lessons that transcend individual lifetimes. These narratives, recorded in registers, whispered in hearths, and remembered in oral tradition, provide a vivid portrait of life in a community where marriage was controlled, kinship was paramount, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior were enforced with a combination of moral authority, social pressure, and communal memory. They reveal the tension between human desire and social obligation, the fragility of life under extreme isolation, and the haunting beauty of a society that survived for centuries while navigating the delicate balance between cohesion and consequence. The village's peculiar customs did not exist in isolation from the wider world, even if that world seemed distant and often inaccessible. Neighbors from surrounding settlements, traveling merchants, and the occasional magistrate or cleric who ventured into the mountains were quick to notice the village's insularity, and their reactions ranged from bewilderment to outright alarm. Tales of marriages restricted solely to the village population spread through the region, whispered in taverns, at markets, and along dusty roads, often embroidered with speculation and exaggeration. To outsiders, the practice appeared unnatural, even morally suspect, a stark contrast to the norms of more open communities where alliances with neighboring towns were common and encouraged. Traveling chroniclers and officials sometimes recorded their impressions in letters, reports, or diaries, highlighting both fascination and discomfort. They described a population that was strikingly uniform in appearance, behavior, and custom, and yet resistant to outside influence. Merchants noted that trade was limited, conversations with villagers were cautious, and that invitations to join communal events were rare and heavily mediated by elders. Even brief interactions suggested that the community operated according to rules unfamiliar and perhaps incomprehensible to outsiders, where social bonds, loyalty, and marital strategy were prioritized above all else. The European perspective on such a village was often tinged with moral judgment. Visitors interpreted the practice as a form of self-imposed isolation, sometimes attributing it to superstition, fear of outsiders, or even innate eccentricity. Some accounts express concern over the health of the population, noting repeated illness or deformities that could be observed in children, while others emphasize the resilience and cohesion of the community, albeit in a way that seemed almost unnatural. These external observations, filtered through curiosity and sometimes horror, painted the village as a living anomaly, a society apart from the rhythms of ordinary European life. Despite these perceptions, there was little direct interference. The village's geographic isolation, combined with its internal cohesion, allowed it to maintain its practices largely unchecked. Outsiders could observe, speculate, and record, but they rarely had the power or inclination to alter the tightly controlled social fabric. In this way, the village became both a curiosity and a cautionary tale, a microcosm of human ingenuity and obstinacy, a society that thrived within its own rules even as it fascinated, unsettled, and sometimes alarmed those who looked in from beyond the mountains.